Hello, I'm Mary Valentich, and I'm with Gayle James. Gayle and I have been friends and colleagues for many years here in the Faculty of Social Work, University of Calgary. The focus is on Gayle's social work career. And we're going to start, Gayle, with your early years. Tell me about what the foundation was.
Well, I didn't know it was a foundation for starters, because social work found me later on in my life. But I think growing up in rural Alberta was important. I learned a lot about a sense of community and cooperation and partnership and diversity too, because it was a community that had a very mixed background in terms of people who come from other parts of the world. It was a very comfortable place to grow up because people both had privacy and solitude, but they also had a sense of community spirit that was quite remarkable. And so I'm very grateful for that and for going to a one-room country schoolhouse.
Was that very important for you?
It was important for me because my father was the teacher, and I had all four of the Gilchrist kids had their dad as a teacher for quite extended periods of their lives.
Where were you in the midst of those four?
In the four, I'm number 3, but there's about a 13-year gap between the first two and the next two. And so my mom was 40 when I was born and 43 when my kid brother was born. And by then, my older sister had essentially left home. She was a teacher because she wasn't old enough to get into nursing school at the Calgary General. And when I was about 2 or 3, then my older brother was in World War II in the Burma jungles.
Wow.
Yeah.
What stands out for you in terms of that particular background?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. For those of us who were growing up in that place in that period of time, because it was largely a German-Russian community, so many of our young German youth, if you will, I think, prove they were good Canadians or whatever. They were among the first to enlist. And my dad lost 85% of his school class in the war. And so that was a terrible tragedy for our community and for many other communities in rural Alberta. And we built our memorial arenas all over Alberta as a result of all the youth we lost in World War II. And we'd have November 11th memorial services, which to this day I can barely get through. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because of being a child in that period of time, mm-hmm. and the war was very influential. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think was very influential for my entire life was when you grow up in rural Alberta, life and death aren't in a sense separate components. It's one long stream, whether it's people, humans who pass on, as it were, or it's animals or pets or whatever. So I think the other sort of special privilege that we had growing up there is we saw the continuity of life and death, and we accepted it. That was the way life was, the way the world was. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where did you continue with your formal schooling?
Well, I had to leave home to be able to go to high school. I took grade 10 by correspondence because my parents thought I wasn't old enough to be on my own when I was 14, but it was okay when I was 15. So I went to a small town, lived with a family that actually my dad had taught, and was on my own in high school for a couple of years, and it was a great experience in a rural high school, and exceptionally different from going to the one-room country school. My dad as teacher had encouraged debate, and also in our one-room school had used the mornings to teach the Alberta curriculum. And then in the afternoon he taught all of us things we thought we needed to know about the world. So I went off to high school thinking that everybody learned about Karl Marx in grade 7 to discover it wasn't true. I went off with a sense of social justice and sticking up for people's rights, which is partly how I got suspended from school in grade 12, which I just took for granted was one of the prices you pay for speaking up on things.
What did you speak up about?
It had to do with a student in our school who had been the top student in school since grade 1 and came to grade 12 with superior grades. And he lived on the wrong side of the tracks. And somebody had to get the Gold Cup award for our high school. I was chair of the committee to pick the person, since I obviously wasn't going to get the Gold Cup.
Right.
And our principal had in his mind someone more affluent, shall I say, to get it. And my committee and I said, no, it has to go to this particular person. And I still remember my principal saying to me, Miss Gilchrist, it would be too bad if we had a falling out after working together for 2 years. And the next thing I knew, I was out of school.
And how long were you out of school?
A couple of weeks. And I wasn't even concerned about it. I just moved back home. And amazingly, my parents weren't concerned about it. But it did turn out that that marvelous young man never did get the cup.
Oh, that's
He
disappointing.
never did. And when he won a Southam Fellowship in journalism and joined the Globe and Mail editorial staff, when he won the fellowship, my mom went and had a duplicate cup made and sent it to him.
So that was the beginning of your activist
It
career.
was, but I didn't even know that it was activism. I thought that's just what she did.
You supported those who couldn't perhaps speak
Yeah,
for themselves.
and also part of it is because, my late father and one of the farm neighbors had spent a lot of evenings out organizing farmers back when they were victimized by wheat cartels and the like, and also organizing to try and get a health care plan for teachers for Alberta.
Teachers seem to be in your background a
Yes,
great deal, and I
yes.
know you to be an absolutely superb teacher. Who influenced you the most as far as your own teaching?
Oh, a lot of people did, actually. People talk about having a mentor in their life. I've been very lucky to have many mentors. My dad, I think, was an excellent teacher. And also, I suppose another good thing, never assigned homework to kids. I didn't know what homework was until I left home. Growing up in rural Alberta, you can't have kids doing homework at night if they have to milk 60 cows, right? So the way my dad taught with quite passion and enthusiasm was wonderful. I went to U of A, and at University of Alberta was an English major. And I had 3 Governors General Award winners in literature as my undergraduate profs, including Eli Mandel and Dr. Henry Kreisel. And to think of it now, that you could be in a class of 15 or 20 people with people like this. I mean, it wouldn't happen often now that when someone like Dr. Kreisel, having explained this poem to us, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, on the last day of class, simply walked in, read the poem, got a standing ovation, and then he walked out of class.
So you had some wonderful examples.
I had
of
wonderful examples, and certainly at University of Toronto as well. I was very lucky in going to social work school or graduate school in Toronto because, again, I had people like your partner, Jim Gripton, who was my faculty advisor, Albert Rose, who later became the dean, John Morgan, people who were leaders in policy, who understood direct practice through to all forms of macro practice. It was wonderful to have people like this. I was just extremely lucky to have had a series of mentors like that.
That's terrific. What prompted your decision to enter social work?
It wasn't my decision. Social work picked me. When I was finishing my BA at U of A, I actually had, because I'd been a little bit involved in Radio Society, etc., and I had a 3-year career track mapped out where I would first of all go to a radio station in Lethbridge for a year, to CJCA in Edmonton for a year, and then to CHUM in Toronto for a year. Not to be on air, but to do the writing, because I was an English major. But toward the end of my 3rd year of my BA, the director of student counseling, I ran into him in the hallway at U of A. He said, you should have one of those interest inventories. I said, fine, to Dr. Huff. And it was a time when U of A was small enough where people actually knew the president and the director of counseling, et cetera. I had the interest inventory, and it said I should be a social worker. Now, this interest inventory was the kind that is so primitive. Would you rather be Paul Bunyan or Florence Nightingale? Well, if you fill it out a certain way. And then I got a phone call saying that the Guidance Clinic, which is now Alberta Mental Health Services, they were looking for a social worker, psychiatric social worker. And would I like to come to the interview? I thought, well, this will be interesting since I don't even know what a psychiatric social worker is.
Right.
But because by then my dad had died when I was 19 and finishing university, and my mom and my kid brother were moving to Edmonton, I canceled the, if you want, broadcast writing kind of career. And a month after I turned 20, I suddenly became a psychiatric social worker counseling families and kids.
My goodness.
A very kind supervisor at University of Toronto, Dr. Don Meeks, who just got the Order of Canada. He's one of the people who taught me clinical methods. He said to me one day about my experience in the early days, he said, well, I don't think you did 1 ounce of good. But he said, you're fairly pleasant, so you probably didn't do any harm either. But it was a time when there were very few trained social workers.
Right.
So when you went to work there, you were under the supervision of someone with a master's degree in social work. But also, you had to promise you'd go do a social work degree within 2 years, or you were without a job.
Right, right.
So that's how we trained people. Aside from the mental health experience, when I came back from that, I did work in the Guidance Clinic until 1967. And then I joined a brand new thing called the Education Clinic that was just being established. And it was a diagnostic clinic in the Edmonton Public School Board that was put together by a team of people, including the superintendent, who was smart enough to know that under the Canada Assistance Plan, which had come in 1966, that he could get 80% funding for this adventure if the city of Edmonton put up 20%. And the province paid 30%, the federal government 50%, and the city of Edmonton 20%. And we put together a crackerjack diagnostic clinic for kids, which unfortunately doesn't exist today, but it was a multidisciplinary team. And I was the first school board social worker not to also be a teacher.
Okay, so that was a breakthrough.
It was
then.
a big breakthrough. And again, I occasionally got into some difficulty because not long into this experience, we decided most of our parents did not need family therapy. Their kids needed a treatment program for their dyslexia. And we started a parents group a few months later. The school board wasn't necessarily thrilled with the idea. And in fact, one assistant superintendent opined that angry parents would burn down the school board building in Edmonton.
The idea of empowering parents was not yet mainline.
No, in fact, Mary, I wasn't allowed to bring parents together who were our clients after hours unless they were sick. So I discussed it with the parents, and they said, yes, we'll all say we have mental health problems. Then it was fine.
Then
they could come and meet in our boardroom in our clinic if they had family problems and they were mentally ill, but not if they were well, right? So we went along with it.
Right.
And of course, the school board wasn't necessarily thrilled with some of our lobbying cabinet ministers and the like, and laid the blame at my feet. A marvelous superintendent who'd set this whole thing up, he defended me to the board, to the school trustees, on the grounds that my code of ethics in social work was different from that of the Alberta Teachers Association, in that the ATA code at that time said you're responsible to your school board first. Our code, as you know, Mary said, we're responsible to clients and for service, etc. So the superintendent defended me. I did not get fired or suspended. And the superintendent who did that is Dr. Tom Baker,
Oh, for heaven's
who
sake.
founded the Baker Cancer Clinic. He
Isn't
became
that
chair of the
wonderful?
board the same year he hired me. And now I go there quite often.
Yes, you do. I can see many different aspects already that are that become very important as your career continues. The code of ethics, for example, and certainly the weaving of your clinical work with the lobbying and the advocacy. So this was all part and parcel of this first position.
Yes.
That's wonderful. How long were you there?
I was there in, I think it was 7 or 8 years in the school board. They were wonderful years. I got to work with multidisciplinary team that was superb. And also, because we were quite progressive, it meant that a lot of the pediatric neurologists, ophthalmologists, pediatricians, etc., were so glad to have someone who understood what they did about neurology, child development, etc. They were incredibly cooperative. Not only cooperative, but they volunteered to be the advisory group to our parents group.
That's terrific.
And they'd come and help us put on workshops, and we'd help them put on workshops for physicians and whatever.
And multidisciplinary work was not really that prominent at that point
No,
in
it
time.
wasn't, but it was wonderfully rich. It was
Right.
just terrific.
Now, what positions followed?
After that, I joined the University of Calgary,
Okay.
actually.
And how did that
And
come
then,
about?
well, we had, as you would know, our founding dean, Dr. Tyler, a brilliant and flamboyant man,
Yes.
had asked if I would join the faculty in the Edmonton division, because we had 2 divisions. And he asked if I would consider doing that. And I thought about it for a year.
What made you hesitate?
Well, partly, to be gross about it, part of it was money. The Edmonton Public School Board was very progressive, and they paid their senior people to work, to be able to stay at the front line and work. You didn't have to go into administration.
In order to
And
go
in
through
fact,
the
the
ranks.
pay scale for social workers in the Edmonton Public School Board was the pay scale for associate professors at the University of Calgary.
That's
Except,
impressive.
Yes, so I was going to lose a little money and a week's holiday. And I thought about it for a year. And also, I didn't have a doctoral degree, which I thought I should have, and I didn't. But it was partly to develop the Edmonton program. And for a while, the late Dr. Bill Kerwin and I were the Edmonton program for a while.
So there were only 2 of you there?
Yeah, well, first of all, there was Bill for 1 year, and then Bill and I were the Edmonton Division program, and then, of course, the rest, we went on and added many other academics, et cetera.
But I take it then for a while you were teaching everything.
Yes, Bill and I were teaching everything, and our senior colleagues, whom we knew from the practice community, came in to teach a lot of the electives, like the person who taught about aging, for example, was head of the Seniors Bureau for the entire province, a senior MSW, brilliant woman. So we had those connections
And
to fill in.
That's wonderful, having those connections.
Oh.
You've always stayed connected, I think,
Yes,
to the community.
yes,
How
yeah.
many years were you in Edmonton?
19, and then I
19.
came to Calgary because I was at UFC for 29 years and all, and
29
I'd
years.
already been, in practice for about 15 years before I wandered into the academic realm.
Right, what year was it that you actually moved here to Calgary?
I moved in 1994.
Fine.
Yeah.
And what were the courses that you taught primarily?
Mostly human growth and behavior and policy, and also introduction to Canadian social welfare, which was a class for students who were not social work students, but it was to partly get them interested in social work, and also, if nothing else, to teach them about the provisions and policies of how we live in what was the Canadian welfare state.
I wonder if you could tell me first about how you got involved with the Professional Social Work Association.
Well, because first of all, they shut me out.
Oh, okay.
Because when I was an untrained social worker in mental health, my then boss, Bud Hansen, had a master's degree in social work. And at certain times during, say, once a month, he and my supervisor would go off to the Alberta Association of Social Workers meetings. Well, I couldn't go because I wasn't eligible to be a member with my background in Shakespeare and no social work degree. So the minute I could join, which was the fall of 1962, when I went to University of Toronto, I could join as a student member.
Okay.
So I did. And then I was part of the group then.
Good.
But initially, I was rejected out of hand.
There seems
because
to
I
be a
wasn't
pattern
qualified.
here of some people
Yes.
keeping you out, and that only seems to inspire you.
Well, and so that's how I got started. And then to my amazement, in 1978, at a regular Edmonton area social work meeting, our representative to the Canadian Association of Social Workers Board, Mary Morrison Davis, she'd been our rep, and her term of office was running out. And she stood up, and she was a very impassioned older woman who had driven a truck, I think, during World War II, and was involved with veterans. And she said, we need some new blood in the Canadian Social Work Association, and I'm leaving, and so I'm nominating Gayle in my place. Well, I nearly slid off my chair, because to me it was like being asked to join the Senate, given the average age of the Canadian board. And the director of social work at Glenrose Hospital in Edmonton, Harold Doxey, seconded the motion. So I came home from the meeting rather bug-eyed, but I was on the Canadian Social Work Board, and it was 1968, and I was 28 years old.
That's quite a phenomenal
So,
big
well, I was
step.
startled.
Yes, I can see that.
But I happily went.
You went, and what did you gain from that experience?
Some ideas about the marked differences among and between Canadian provinces. Some things I might not have expected. Alberta and Quebec as members, always voting together and having similar concerns.
Yes.
It also gave me a perspective of all of Canada and how similar basic issues like poverty, et cetera, were in all parts of Canada. And I'd done my master's thesis on poverty.
Okay.
So it was a continuation of
that interest, yes.
But there were incredible things you could do then as a profession, because we had the money to do it, in that the federal government was still paying, you know, essentially 50% of the costs of services in the provinces. And Alberta was the only province that had preventive social services. So if you had bright ideas about how to do things, there was actually a public commitment and funding. And that never ended until 1996.
So you came in at a good time.
Wonderful time. I feel very badly for some of my young colleagues starting out now, in that it's like we have to fight for everything all over again. That, you know, I graduated with my master's in 1966, the year that Canada Assistance Plan started. So from the time of my professional career onward, there were real things you could do with very real resources.
And
It's
certainly
very
poverty
different.
was something
Oh,
you focused a great
yes,
deal of
yeah,
attention on.
yeah.
So how many years were you then a member on the CASW?
It actually seems like it was probably endless, and that I was perennial, growing in their basement like a mushroom. I became president of the Alberta Association in '79 through '81, and then president of the Canadian, I believe '81 to '83. And by then, I'd also got involved internationally. One of our best policy colleagues in Canada, Dr. Richard Splain, had brought this British woman around to visit the associations, Mary Windsor. And she was the president of the International Federation. Well, most of us didn't know there was an International Federation, but our colleague Gwyneth Gowanlock and I resolved we'd go to their meeting, which was in 1978 in Israel.
And that would have been a first, I would think.
It was.
Had they heard of us?
Yeah, they had heard of us, Mary, only because when Gwyneth and I, wide-eyed Canadians, got to the board meeting, the chairman of the board, the treasurer, whom I loathed on sight, and later became one of my best friends, crossed his sturdy arms, stared at us, and said, well, Canada, you probably don't have a vote because you haven't paid your fees for 4 years.
Oh, my.
And Gwyneth and I looked at each other like, fees? What fees? Anyway, they relented. And again, you know, I spent a lot of time. I came home from that meeting being vice president for North America
That
of
is-
the International Federation, something that I...
So what are the particular skills that you think you had that people obviously saw that would brought you into this?
Actually, a lot of it is, most of it is being open to opportunities. I firmly believe, as I used to tell my students, all you can do in anything in life is you show up, pay attention, tell the truth, and don't be invested in the outcome. As long as you try to start fixing things, it won't work. There are too many variables, and I think having more than a belief, but some training in chaos theory and in quantum physics, etc., thanks to Dick Ramsey, that you learn to just be open when things, pardon me, when things occur in your life, to say, okay, I didn't think about this. It's a remarkable coincidence. This looks like an interesting opportunity. That's no different than when Dr. Huff said, why don't you have an interest inventory and see what you'd like to do with your life? It's no different than the accident that Mary Morrison Davis would stand up at a meeting and say, we need some new blood in the Canadian Social Work Association. These coincidences are so important.
The coincidences are important, but clearly people saw in you something that they wanted to foster and to see you in a leading role. That's very evident. So clearly
you're more than kind.
I think I reflect the views of many, though. I remember the incredible applause for you when you were president of the International
in
Stockholm,
Sweden.
in Sweden.
Yes, in
that's
Stockholm,
right. And
yes.
that doesn't just happen. So, what were some of the big issues that you addressed at any level of organization?
I think in the International Federation, one of the things that was important in terms of the process is there are now like about 78 countries that belong to IFSW. At the time, there were about 54. And of course, the dominant countries were the United States and Canada in the North American region, particularly the US. And one of the things that I think was worthwhile was to always make sure everybody spoke at the board meetings. The US had, in fact, one vote, just like Aruba did, or Brazil. And to make sure that you always called on the opinions of the countries that were not the US, because I think for so many years, and I adore my colleagues in NASW in the US, but simply because it was the Americans with their multi-million dollars of budgets, they tended to take over or to assume the power for the entire group. So I think that from a process point of view, the good thing I did was probably pay equal attention to everybody. The issues that I think preoccupied me most were human rights issues. And being a Canadian with a Charter of Rights is a very, quote, good thing. Having been, the United Nations documents to back us up was very worthwhile. So the very first thing that I think I influenced heavily was for us to start a Human Rights Commission with 5 regional members of the 5 regions in the world. And those people worked very hard to free imprisoned social workers, because many of our colleagues were in jail in developing countries and some in developed countries, and in joining governments to help us free social workers and social work students. It wasn't just for trained social workers. And in that, we, as Canadians, certainly as a Canadian, I had enormous help from the Canadian government in tracking people, and they were very good at the diplomatic level. We've had in Canada very skilled, very professional diplomats who truly understood human rights issues.